A woman working as a waitress on a cruise ship froze in horror when she saw her husband, who had died 7 years ago. When she dared to approach him, she heard something that almost made her heart stop. Emily had been anxious since the early morning. Something in her body was telling her that she was about to discover something important, although she didn't dare to predict what exactly was going to happen. For the past few days, she had noticed changes in her body, small details she couldn't ignore, constant fatigue, morning sickness, and an unexplained feeling that something was different. Her husband, Michael, had noticed that Emily was behaving differently, but hadn't given it much thought. On that particular day, after much contemplation, Emily decided to go to the pharmacy and buy a pregnancy test. Deep inside, something was telling her that she was ready to hear the news that would change their lives forever. Returning home, barely aware of what was happening, her hands trembled as she held the test. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound breaking the silence in the small bathroom, where Emily waited eagerly. Her breathing was slow, but each second felt like an eternity. And then, finally, the line appeared, or rather 2 lines. She was pregnant. With her heart pounding and a mixture of surprise and joy, Emily looked in the mirror. It was real. At last, after so many years of trying, they were going to be parents. She couldn't hold back and burst into a loud laugh of pure joy, a laugh that came from the depths of her soul. Michael wasn't home at that moment, but Emily couldn't wait another minute to share the news. She grabbed her phone and immediately called him, her voice shaking with excitement. "Mike, I've got something to tell you," she said, holding back tears. "What's going on, sweetheart? Are you okay?" he asked, concerned by the tone in her voice. "We're expecting a baby," Emily exclaimed, unable to contain it any longer. On the other end of the phone, Michael paused for a moment before saying with joy, "I can't believe it, Emily. Are you serious?" "Yes, Mike, it's true. We're going to be parents," she replied, already sobbing. "I'm coming home right now, wait for me," he quickly responded, hanging up with excitement as he rushed back home. When Michael arrived home, Emily was waiting for him in the living room, still holding the pregnancy test in her hands, not fully comprehending that it had finally happened. As soon as Michael walked through the door, he immediately embraced Emily, lifting her into his arms and gently spinning her around. "I can't believe it," he said, looking into her eyes with awe. "This is the best day of my life." Emily smiled and nodded. "I can't believe it either," she replied. Michael knelt before Emily, gently placing his hands on her stomach, as if he could already feel something, though they both knew it was too early for that. "I can't wait to meet our baby," he whispered. Emily looked at him with tenderness, stroking his hair. But there was another secret she hadn't told him yet. Earlier that morning, at the clinic where she had her blood tests done, the doctor had given her more news, unexpected but joyful. "It's not just one baby, Mike," Emily began with a sly smile on her face. Michael looked at her, puzzled, not fully understanding what she meant. What do you mean?" he laughed nervously. Emily took his hands in hers and looked him straight in the eyes, savoring the moment. "We're having twins," she almost whispered. Michael's eyes widened in surprise, and his shock quickly turned into a laugh of pure joy. "Twins," he exclaimed, his voice echoing through the room. "I can't believe it. This is incredible." Emily laughed with him, their joy almost tangible. Michael hugged her again, this time even tighter, as if he never wanted to let her go. In that moment, all their problems, all the struggles of the past years, seemed to disappear. The only thing that mattered was the future with their 2 children, waiting ahead. That night, lying in bed, holding each other and dreaming of the future, they started making plans. They talked about names, how to organize their home for the twins, and all the dreams they wanted to fulfill as a family. Life seemed perfect, and for the first time in a long while, Emily felt complete peace. "I promise, we'll always be together, no matter what," Michael said, kissing her on the forehead before falling asleep. And though those words brought Emily a sense of calm, fate had other plans that would change their lives forever. In the days following the news of the pregnancy, Emily and Michael were over the moon with happiness. Together, they started planning what their life would be like with twins, imagining every detail with excitement. Emily couldn't stop touching her stomach, even though it hadn't visibly changed yet, but to her, these babies were already the most important thing in the world. Michael, on the other hand, tried to stay calm, but something in his behavior began to worry Emily. Sometimes she noticed how he became lost in thought, staring off into the distance with some hidden anxiety. "Is everything okay?" she would ask him. "Of course, sweetheart. I'm just thinking about how lucky we are," he would reply, kissing her forehead. But Emily felt that something wasn't right. Perhaps it was just fear of the changes that awaited them. One morning, a week after they found out about the pregnancy, Emily woke up with a strange feeling. Michael had left early for a work meeting, but something inside her told her that everything wasn't okay. She tried to ignore it, but a few hours later, when it was already noon, Emily received a phone call that turned her world upside down. "Is this the wife of Michael Thompson?" asked a cold official voice on the other end of the line. "Yes, it's me," Emily replied, her heart beginning to race. "I'm sorry to inform you that your husband has been in a car accident. His vehicle was found in a rural area, but we have been unable to locate his body. The authorities are searching the area, but we don't have more information at this time," the officer said with a calmness that starkly contrasted with the chaos raging inside Emily. The phone slipped from her hands, and the world around her collapsed. Everything she knew, everything she and Michael had planned, seemed to vanish into thin air. Emily rushed to the hospital, hoping it was all a mistake, that someone had made an error. But when she arrived, the reality was even worse than she could have imagined. Michael's car had been found wrecked in a ravine, and the police explained to her that the accident was so severe that survival was nearly impossible. Despite all efforts by the search teams, there were no traces of Michael. Hours passed in a fog of despair. Relatives and close friends began gathering at the hospital, trying to support Emily, though everyone understood that there were no words that could comfort her in that moment. As the night wore on, the hope of finding Michael alive slowly faded. Emily refused to accept reality. It didn't make sense in her heart that Michael could be gone forever. Without a body, there could be no certainty. The police explained to her that the search would continue, but the chances were dwindling. That night, Emily sat alone in the waiting room, hugging her stomach, trying to find comfort in the little beings growing inside her. "They have to find him. He can't have just disappeared," she whispered to herself over and over again. However, the following days brought no new answers. The search was called off, and Emily was left with the horrific reality that her husband was never coming back. The world kept turning, but for her, time had stopped the moment she got that call. The news of the pregnancy, which just a week ago had filled them with so much hope, now seemed like a cruel reminder of the life they would never have. But life didn't stop, and soon Emily faced a new burden. Just a few days after the accident, men with stern faces and threatening glares began showing up at her door. These were the creditors demanding a massive debt that Michael had left behind before his death. Emily, still in shock from her loss, knew nothing about this money. Michael had never told her about any financial problems, let alone such enormous debts. "Your husband owed us a lot of money, and now that he's gone, you have to pay it back," one of the men said, glancing around her small apartment with disdain. "But I don't have that kind of money. I didn't know about this," Emily replied, her voice trembling. "That's not our problem. You have a month to find the money, or things will get worse," the man stated before walking out the door. Emily was left alone in her apartment, with the weight of losing Michael and now the pressure of an enormous debt she had no idea how to pay off. The future they had planned together was crumbling before her eyes, and now, pregnant and alone, she had to find a way to survive. The pain of losing her husband mixed with the fear for the safety of her unborn children. But deep inside, Emily knew she had to be strong, not just for herself but for the twins, who had become her only hope for a fresh start. Though fate had taken so much from her, Emily wasn't going to give up. Days passed, and she realized that her life had changed irreversibly. Dreams of a happy family with Michael and their children had turned into a daily battle for survival. Bills were piling up, creditors wouldn't leave her alone, and the pain of Michael's absence was just as sharp as the day she heard about his accident. However, Emily understood that she couldn't afford to break down. She had to find a way out for the sake of her children. In the first weeks after the accident, Emily tried selling some of their belongings to scrape together whatever money she could. Michael hadn't left much of value, but every dollar she managed to collect provided temporary relief in the face of the relentless threats. Still, she knew it wouldn't be enough. The debt was too large, and time was running out. When the creditors came back a month later, Emily tried to reason with them, explaining that she was doing everything she could to gather the money, that she was pregnant and alone. But they didn't care. "Time's up," one of the men coldly said, looking her up and down. "We're putting you on the clock." The fear Emily felt in that moment was indescribable. She knew she couldn't count on mercy from these people. If she didn't come up with the money, she feared not only for her life but for the lives of her children. In terror, Emily began taking any job she could find. It didn't matter how hard or poorly paid the work was, the only thing that mattered was moving forward. By day, she worked as a cleaner in offices for a meager wage, and by night, she took shifts in 24-hour convenience stores, working until dawn. Exhaustion gradually took over her, and her body began to succumb to the strain. Emily was pregnant with twins, and the physical and emotional burden was becoming unbearable. But she couldn't afford to rest, there was no time. The creditors continued to threaten her, the interest grew, and the deadline for repaying the debt loomed ever closer. Sometimes, after long shifts, Emily allowed herself a moment of weakness. She would sit in her dark apartment, feeling the slight movements of her children in her belly, and tears would stream down her cheeks uncontrollably. She cried for Michael, for the life they had planned and would never have. She cried from fear of the threats and from the uncertainty of whether she could protect her children. "I'm sorry, my darlings," she whispered, stroking her stomach. "But I promise, I'll do everything to keep you safe." Those children became her only source of strength. Every time she felt their movements inside her, she reminded herself that she had a reason to keep going, that she couldn't give up. And so, day by day, Emily continued her fight, even though her body and mind screamed for the rest she couldn't afford. One evening, after returning home from a long shift at the store, Emily felt a sharp pain in her stomach. She stopped in the middle of the street, placing her hand on her belly, feeling cold sweat run down her forehead. The pain was intense, but the scariest thing was the panic that gripped her. She knew that stress and overwork were affecting her pregnancy. Emily took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Passers-by offered her help, but out of pride, Emily declined, assuring them that she was fine. She walked slowly until she finally reached her small sofa, where she collapsed, feeling her body trembling with exhaustion. She understood that she couldn't continue like this for much longer. If something happened to her, her children would be in danger. But what could she do? Time was running out, and the debt was enormous. 6 months later, after endless work and struggles, Emily finally gave birth, twin boys. Emily was overjoyed but understood that life was about to get even harder. She barely slept. It felt like an endless cycle from which there was no escape. Time passed, and one evening, she received an unexpected call. It was her old friend, Sarah, who had heard about Emily's difficult situation and wanted to offer her a way out. "Emily, I've heard everything about your situation and I want to help," Sarah said in a concerned voice. "I can't give you money, but I heard they're looking for staff to work on a cruise. The pay is good, and you can pay off your debt." Emily froze when she heard the offer. Working on a cruise seemed like a good opportunity, but she understood that it would be hard work, and the scariest part, she would have to leave her children for several weeks. The thought of leaving them frightened her. "I don't know, Sarah," Emily hesitated. "What about the boys? I can't leave them alone." "You could leave them with your aunt for a while," Sarah suggested. "I'll help out whenever I can. Think of the money, Emily. You could pay off the debt and start fresh." Emily hung up the phone, not knowing what to do. She understood that Sarah was right, but it was a difficult decision. That night, she sat by the window, looking at the city lights, thinking about her children's future. Perhaps agreeing to this job was the sacrifice she had to make to secure a better life for them. Finally, after much contemplation, Emily made her decision. She would take the job on the cruise. She knew it would be hard, but for her children, she was ready to do anything. With a mix of fear and determination, she began preparing for her next challenge. On the day Emily boarded the luxurious cruise liner, her heart was divided. On one hand, she felt the joy of a new opportunity to earn enough money to solve her financial problems. On the other hand, she was overwhelmed with sadness about leaving her children. Saying goodbye to them had been one of the hardest moments in her life. She left them in the care of her aunt, who, despite her advanced age, had happily agreed to look after the boys. Emily promised her children that she wouldn't be gone long, although deep down, she wasn't sure how long the journey would last. When she arrived at the port, the enormous cruise ship gleamed under the midday sun. Passengers boarding the ship were wealthy individuals, families from high society who had paid a fortune for a vacation at sea. Everything around her breathed luxury, from the red carpets leading inside the ship to the majestic suites visible from the balconies. It was a completely different world, and for a moment, Emily felt out of place. "This isn't for me," she thought, adjusting the uniform she'd been given. The white shirt and elegant vest were too tight, and she could barely move comfortably. But Emily knew she had no other choice. This job, no matter how hard, was her only chance to pay off the debt and secure a future for her children. She took a deep breath and began her first day as a waitress on the cruise ship. The first few days were extremely difficult. Emily had never worked in such conditions before. The passengers were incredibly demanding, and many didn't hesitate to belittle the staff as if they were nothing. The pressure was constant, serving drinks, cleaning tables, fulfilling all kinds of requests, all while wearing a smile that grew more forced with each passing day. But Emily couldn't complain about the work. She knew that each day brought her one step closer to her goal. Despite the long hours, there were moments when she couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of the world around her. The endless ocean stretched far beyond the horizon, and the gentle sound of waves hitting the ship's hull sometimes soothed her mind. In those rare moments, looking out at the horizon, she allowed herself to dream of the day when she would return home to her children, free of debt and ready to start a new life. One day, after an especially grueling shift, Emily stepped out onto the deck for a moment of rest. The sea breeze blew through her hair, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the cool wind bring some relief. "Beautiful sea, isn't it?" a voice sounded nearby. Emily turned and saw one of her colleagues, and who had also recently started working on the cruise, and was friendly and always tried to lift Emily's spirits when she looked tired. "Yes, it's impressive," Emily replied, trying to smile, though inside, she felt exhausted. "Don't worry, you'll get used to the pace soon," and said with a smile. "It's tough at first, but believe me, it's worth it when you see your paycheck at the end of the month." Emily nodded, understanding that, and was right, but the physical and emotional exhaustion sometimes became too much for her. As they continued their conversation, and mentioned that there would be an important dinner on the main deck that evening for some of the most influential passengers on the cruise. All the waitstaff had been assigned to specific tables, and Emily had the honor of serving one of the most prestigious groups of guests. "You're lucky," and said with a grin. "These passengers often leave big tips. If you do a good job, you could make a lot of money tonight." Emily tried to focus on the positive. Although the thought of serving the elite on board made her a little nervous, she knew this job was her chance. She knew she couldn't afford to make a mistake, so she decided to gather her strength and do her best. By evening, when it was time for the dinner, Emily was ready. The main deck of the cruise ship looked incredible. Huge crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the elegantly set tables. Waiters and waitresses rushed back and forth, serving exquisite dishes and expensive drinks. Emily, mustering her strength, approached the table she had been assigned to serve. As she got closer, she noticed that the people at the table were clearly very important figures, talking to each other with an air of superiority. But suddenly, her gaze stopped on one of the. As she got closer, her gaze froze on one of the men sitting at the table. Emily's breath caught, and the world around her seemed to stop. There, right in front of her, elegantly dressed, was Michael. Emily couldn't believe her eyes. The man she had thought dead for 7 years, her husband, the father of her children, was sitting at that table, laughing and acting as if nothing had ever happened. Next to him was a young woman, stunning and sophisticated, speaking to him with clear familiarity, while he smiled and nodded in response to her words. "No, this can't be," Emily whispered softly to herself, barely audible. At that moment, Michael looked up, and their eyes met. But what happened next was what truly shattered Emily's heart. Michael, recognizing her for a brief moment, quickly turned his gaze away, pretending not to know her. He acted as if she was just another waitress, a stranger in his luxurious world. Emily felt her heart break into 1,000 pieces. Questions flooded her mind, and the shock paralyzed her. How could he be alive? Why had he never come back to her and their children? And who was the woman sitting beside him? All the emotions rushed through her, but one thing became clear: Michael had betrayed her in the cruelest way. Unable to bear it any longer, Emily gently placed the tray on the table and hurried out of the dining hall. Tears streamed down her face, and though she tried to hold them back, the pain was too intense. Michael was alive, but the man she had once loved with all her heart was now a stranger. He had abandoned her to face all the hardships alone, while he enjoyed a life of luxury. That night, in her tiny cabin, Emily couldn't sleep. Her thoughts raced back and forth, unable to process what she had seen. Images of Michael, sitting at that table, his smile, his indifference to her, replayed over and over in her mind. The man she had believed to be dead, the father of her children, was alive and well, enjoying life with another woman. Every time she closed her eyes, his face appeared in front of her, making the pain unbearable. Emily got out of bed and began slowly walking through the corridors of the cruise ship, trying to calm herself, but nothing helped. She needed answers, and she knew she had to get them. Gathering all her resolve, Emily decided she had to confront Michael. The next morning, after finishing her shift, Emily set out to find him. She was told he could be found on the upper deck. Her heart pounded as she climbed the stairs. She didn't know how he would react to her appearance, but it didn't matter. She needed to know why he had disappeared from her life. When she reached the upper deck, she saw him again. Michael stood by the railing, gazing out at the horizon, while the young woman next to him laughed at something, though Emily couldn't hear what. Clenching her fists and taking a deep breath, Emily walked toward them. "Michael," she called out, her voice firm but filled with emotion. Michael slowly turned, his face showing surprise for a moment, but quickly returning to a cold, indifferent expression. "I'm sorry, I think you've mistaken me for someone else," he said politely, but his voice was filled with icy detachment. The young woman beside him looked at Michael curiously but didn't interfere, clearly trusting his words. "Don't you dare pretend you don't know me," Emily responded, her voice trembling with pain. "You can't just pretend not to recognize me. What are you doing here? How are you even alive?" Michael looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion appeared on his face, a mix of guilt and exhaustion. "You weren't supposed to be here," he said quietly. "This isn't what you think." "Not what I think." Emily stepped closer, her voice growing sharper. "You're alive, Michael, and I've spent the last 7 years thinking you were dead. I've been raising our children alone, fighting off the debts you left behind, and now you're just sitting here like nothing ever happened? Who is this woman?" The young woman next to Michael looked at him in confusion, clearly not understanding what was going on. "Michael, what's happening?" she asked quietly, but with a tone of certainty. Michael sighed deeply, as if trying to find the right words, and finally looked Emily directly in the eyes. "I'm sorry, Emily," he began, his voice softening. "I know this is hard to understand, but I had no other choice. I had to disappear." "Disappear?" Emily was in shock. "Disappear from what? From your children? From me? You left me with debts, Michael, and I thought you were dead. I've been hunted by debt collectors because of you." Michael lowered his gaze, unable to meet her accusations any longer. "When I found out about the debt, I panicked," he continued. "It was too much, and I didn't see any other way out. I thought the only way to escape the creditors was to disappear, to pretend I was dead." Emily felt her legs weaken, and she leaned on the railing to keep from collapsing. "You pretended to be dead?" she whispered, barely audible. "And what about me? What about our children?" Michael looked at her, his face now filled with sorrow that he had hidden until this moment. "I know, Emily. I left you. It was cowardly. But I was scared and didn't know how else to get out of the situation. And then I met Kate," he said, gesturing to the young woman beside him. Michael's words cut through Emily like a knife. Everything she had gone through over the past 7 years, the sleepless nights, the fear of creditors, the struggle to raise her children alone, all of it was the result of his decision to run away and start a new life with another woman. Her soul was torn apart by pain and anger. "You took everything from us," Emily cried, her voice trembling with pain and fury. "You just ran away. You left me, you left the kids. And for what? To be with her." She pointed at Kate, who looked at Michael in shock. Michael turned away, unable to face Emily any longer. He knew she was right. He had run away because he was afraid to take responsibility for his actions. "You're right, Emily," Michael said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "I ran. I was a coward. I couldn't face the debt. I thought that by disappearing, I would save you from all of it. But I was wrong." Emily stared at him, her heart pounding. Tears streamed down her face, but now they were not only tears of pain but also of anger. Anger at him for abandoning her and their children to save himself. "You were wrong," she repeated, her voice thick with emotion. "You left me to fight off those debts. I worked day and night, thinking you were dead. While you were here, enjoying life with another woman? How could you? How could you leave your children? You have no idea what I've been through." Michael still couldn't look up. Kate stood next to him, silently taking in the conversation. She could see that Emily was right, but she didn't know what to say. "I made a mistake," Michael continued, his voice barely audible. "But it's over now. I'm not the man you knew anymore." Emily paused for a moment, trying to process everything she had heard. But one question burned in her mind. "What are you going to do now?" Michael took a deep breath, his face showing exhaustion and bitterness. "I can't go back. If I return, the creditors will find me, and it will lead to even more trouble. Kate and I were planning to leave the country after this cruise. This was our last chance to start over." Emily stared at him with contempt. He was still thinking only about himself. Even now, when his lies had been exposed, he was only concerned with saving himself. "And what about me?" she finally asked. "What about our children? Are you just going to leave us again?" Michael was silent. There was nothing he could say. He had already made his choice. In that moment, Emily realized that the man standing before her had long ceased to be her husband. The Michael she had loved died the moment he decided to pretend to be dead. The person before her was a stranger, willing to abandon his family for his own benefit. "You're not the man I loved," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "You betrayed us. You betrayed your children. And you're going to pay for that." Emily turned and, without another word, walked away, leaving Michael and Kate standing on the deck. Her heart was shattered, but within her, a new resolve began to form. Michael wouldn't get away with what he had done. Back in her small cabin, Emily sat on her bed, hugging herself, and cried. But this time, she knew she wouldn't let this go. She wanted justice. Michael had to face the consequences of his actions, and she would do everything in her power to make sure of it. The next morning, Emily woke up with a firm decision. Michael couldn't just run away and leave her with all the burdens. She gathered all her strength and began to plan her next move. Later that evening, Emily made a bold choice and called the creditors who had been threatening her for months. "I have what you need," she said into the phone, her voice steady. I know where Michael is. And I have information that might interest you. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Go on, the man finally replied. We're listening. Emily explained everything she knew. She offered to help them capture Michael in exchange for their promise to leave her and her children alone. She told them that the cruise ship would return to port in 3 days, and they would have the perfect opportunity to catch her ex-husband. All right, the creditor replied after a short pause. We'll help you. But if you try to deceive us, it won't end well for you. I'm not trying to deceive you, Emily answered coldly. I just want him to get what he deserves. For the next 3 days, Emily could barely sleep. Her thoughts kept spinning around what was about to happen. She knew it was dangerous, but she had no other choice. She couldn't live in fear anymore. Her children deserved better. On the morning of the 3rd day, Emily continued her work on the ship, pretending everything was normal, even though inside, she was a storm of emotions. She watched Michael and Kate enjoying themselves, completely unaware of what awaited them. She knew the ship was about to dock soon. Finally, the evening arrived. The cruise liner docked at the port, and the passengers began disembarking. Emily kept an eye on Michael and Kate, sending a quick message to the creditors. They're in the hall, about to disembark. Moments later, everything unfolded quickly. The creditors were waiting at the dock, disguised as regular passers-by. As Michael and Kate walked down the gangplank, completely unaware, the creditors closed in on them. Emily could hear the commotion from the ship as the trap was sprung. She watched from the ship's deck as Michael, realizing what was happening, tried to flee, with a panicked Kate following close behind. The creditors were determined not to let them escape. Michael! Kate screamed, grabbing his hand in desperation, seeking protection from the man who had promised her a new life. What do we do? Michael was in a state of shock, his eyes darting around wildly as he looked for a way out. But the creditors had blocked all possible exits. You're not getting away, kid, one of the creditors sneered, coldly eyeing him. You owe us a lot of money, and now it's time to pay up. Kate continued to scream, trying to get Michael to do something, but he stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. Emily watched from the ship, her heart pounding. This was the moment. It was all coming to an end. Michael! Kate cried, clinging to his arm. Do something. But Michael didn't move, his face twisted in terror. He realized the life he had tried to build on lies was crashing down around him. It's over, Michael, the creditor said coldly. You thought you could cheat us and run away? No one escapes their debts. Breathing heavily, Michael raised his hands in surrender, finally understanding that everything he had built on deceit was collapsing in front of his eyes. He began, but his voice wavered. I made a mistake. I thought I could start over. A mistake, the creditor snapped back. You owe us a massive sum. You'll either pay it all back or you'll die. At that moment, Emily had already come down to the dock, approaching the scene. Her face was calm, but inside, she still wrestled with a storm of emotions. Michael, she began softly. You left us. You left your children. You ran away from your responsibilities. You thought you could start a new life, but you didn't think about us. I can't forgive you for that. Michael looked at her, his eyes full of regret and guilt. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. You'll face the consequences of what you did, Emily continued, her voice steady now. You can't just run away from all this. The creditors were done waiting. With a quick gesture, one of the men signaled to his colleagues, and 2 of them grabbed Michael, twisting his arms behind his back. We'll take it from here, the leader of the creditors said coldly to Emily. He'll pay for his debts, according to the law. Emily nodded, understanding that this was the end. Michael would be punished for his actions, and although it wouldn't bring back the years she had lost, it gave her a sense of justice. Kate, sobbing, pleaded with Michael to do something, but it was useless. Emily watched as they led Michael away, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. He had been her husband, the father of her children, but the man she had loved had long disappeared. Later that night, Emily returned to her cabin, feeling as though she had finally freed herself from the weight of the past. She couldn't change what had happened, but now she was free to rebuild her life. Her children were waiting for her at home, and that was all that mattered now. The next morning, she left the cruise ship, her journey full of pain, betrayal, and the unexpected encounter with her past finally over. Before she could leave, the ship's captain called her to his office. Emily, the captain said respectfully, I've been informed about your situation. We witnessed how things unfolded. It's a terrible situation. We know you have 2 young children, so here's a bonus, this should help you for a while. Emily thanked the captain, her voice filled with gratitude and exhaustion. Thank you so much, Captain. I don't even know how to repay you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work on your ship. With that, Emily walked out of his office and headed down the gangway. As she stepped off the ship, she felt lighter than she had in years. The long years of suffering and heartache were behind her. Now she was ready to return to her children and start a new life. When she reached the dock, her Aunt Rose was waiting for her with the boys. Emily ran to them, her heart bursting with joy. She hugged her children tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks, but this time, they were tears of happiness. "I'll never leave you again," she promised, holding her sons close. "Everything's going to be okay now." They headed home together, where Emily knew a new life awaited them. She no longer feared debts or betrayal. She had endured, and she had won. Now, her only focus was on making sure her children had the happiest future possible. As for Michael, his life no longer looked so sweet. The debt he owed to the creditors was enormous. In the years he had been hiding, the interest had continued to grow, and now the amount seemed insurmountable. The creditors, operating within the law, gave him two options: either he would go to prison for failing to meet his financial obligations, or he would begin repaying the debt through work that they would control. Michael chose the second option, hoping it would somehow lead to an escape. All the assets he had acquired in recent years, including his car and any remaining savings, were seized to cover part of the debt. He was forced to work for the creditors, performing various physically demanding jobs, from construction to warehouse work. These jobs were poorly paid, and Michael knew the debt would hang over him for years to come. Nevertheless, he managed to avoid prison through his labor. Michael became more and more reclusive, focusing entirely on his work. He rarely interacted with others, preferring to remain in the shadows. Each month, he managed to make small payments toward the debt, though he had no idea when, or if, he would ever be free from the financial trap he had created. He clung to a faint hope that one day things might improve, but deep down, he knew he would be paying off this debt for the rest of his life. While Michael faced the consequences of his actions, Emily continued to rebuild her new life. She managed to open a small bakery, which provided her with a stable income. Her children grew up happy and healthy, surrounded by the love and care of their mother and Aunt Rose. Emily had let go of the past and focused on the future. She understood that she was a strong woman, capable of overcoming any challenge, and her life was now filled with new opportunities. Thank you for listening to the story. Please share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to our channel Tell Me a Story. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. It motivates us to continue working on new stories every day. Don't miss the next amazing tale, coming soon to your screen. We're so grateful that you're with us. You can check out the full catalog of stories in the description below. See you next time.